Welcome to The Learning Core, a podcast by Telos on the Telos channel. Together, we'll interrogate the core issues of conflict with experts from around the world and uncover the path forward toward creative action in our communities. My name is Sarah Sturm, and I'm your host. Today, we're wrapping up our series of conversations about nonviolence. At Telos, we believe that active nonviolence promotes freedom and justice and is grounded in a spirit of love and hope. Creative and clear resistance against all forms of violence, direct, structural, and cultural, heals our world and paves the path to reconciliation. Just peacemaking is a courageous, countercultural, and purpose-driven way of life. For today's conversation, I'm joined by Rula Salameh, a veteran journalist, community organizer, and the Education and Outreach Director in Palestine for Just Vision, an organization that fills a media gap on Israel-Palestine through independent storytelling and strategic audience engagement. Rula's been a producer on several of Just Vision's films, including Naila and the Uprising, the film that frames our conversation today. In our conversation, we'll discuss the importance of telling the often unheard stories of courageous women and the power these stories have both to transform the world, but also the communities who are inspired today by a different way of engaging violence. If you haven't seen Naila and the Uprising yet, I highly encourage you to watch it, and you can find a link in the description for this episode. In short, in Naila and the Uprising, we see how women-led civil resistance can stir the masses, put pressure on power holders, and effect real structural change. The film tells the story of Naila Ayesh and a fierce community of women at the front lines of the First Intifada in the late 1980s. When a nationwide uprising breaks out in the occupied Palestinian territories, a young woman in Gaza must make a choice between love, family, and freedom. Undaunted, she embraces all three, joining a clandestine network of women in a movement that forces the world to recognize the Palestinian right to self-determination for the first time and is one of the most vibrant, nonviolent mobilizations in Palestinian history. Rula, welcome to the podcast. We're so honored and thrilled to have you join us to talk a little bit more about the film Naila and the Uprising, but also about why it matters in this moment and how it ties into the bigger context and realities on the ground that we're seeing right now. So before we dive into our conversation about the film, I'd love you to share a little bit more about who you are, the community you live in, what about this film resonates with you, and why you feel it's particularly important because of who you are.
Thank you, Sarah. My name is Rula Salameh. I am a Palestinian who was born and raised in East Jerusalem in a neighborhood called Beit Hanina. I get my education at Birzeit University, and then I really managed to travel a lot and talk about Palestine and Palestinians and the obstacles that we are facing living under the occupation all my life. And I am a journalist, and I'm working with Just Vision as Education and Outreach Director in Palestine for the last 17 years.
Wonderful. It's so helpful to know you and a little bit more about your background, where you live, the community you're in. What about Naila and the Uprising resonates with you? Why is it a film that you think it is important for people to see and for us to see, especially in this moment?
This film is among a rest of number of films that I was the Palestinian producer, but I feel this film is really so connected to me personally and connected to the Palestinian women in Palestine. So this film is talking about the Palestinian women and their resistance under the occupation, and the really very important role they played during the First Intifada, which was in 1987, and also before. But the focus was the role of Palestinian women under the occupation during the First Intifada, and women were talking about what they used to do and the obstacles they faces and how is it for women to live under the occupation, and how they decide to unite themselves and work together to support men and resisting the occupation. It wasn't really an easy film, and the stories that we get from the Palestinian women, some of these stories were the first that I personally heard from Palestinian women. And what was really unique that when we interviewed men and get to know their role during the first Intifada. Men, they were telling us that you should go and do the interviews with Palestinian women because they were the one who did a unique role, and they played really very important role, especially when men were arrested from the Israeli occupation, and then women felt that they are alone and they have really a big responsibility towards their community. So a lot of really very powerful stories about women, and it was really very important at that time to talk about women role because we want to encourage Palestinian young Palestinian females to read about the history of women and try to get these stories out and get also to have Palestinian female model that they can follow while they are resisting the occupation here in Palestine.
There are so many wonderful themes you just brought up, but I think what you said is so important, that this film highlights the role of women not just in transforming the society around them or the occupation. It's not just external political advocacy, but the women in doing that advocacy did so much to transform the society around them, partly out of necessity, but partly because they were just brilliant and so many creative ideas to add and made the movement that much richer because of it. And that makes me think of one thing that we talk about at Telos, which is mutual flourishing or the beloved community. And part of what that idea came to mind for me as right now is because it's not just about the goals we have for what we want to see the world change, but it's also about the communities we build that help us get there. And I think that that's what you just described and what this film highlights so beautifully, that the movement, these women, not just transformed the world around them, but also really transformed their society. And I'm wondering, you said it's so important, especially for young women and Palestinian women, to see these films, in part to see role models and see themselves as part of the story. Where do you see people like this today? Do you see young women, other folks who have been inspired by Naila? I know you've traveled around and shown this film within Palestine. Where do you see people taking inspiration from this and going out and advocating today in their communities?
Thank you, Sarah, for this really very important question. I think that part of why I feel this film is really very important and have different messages, not only for Palestinian women, but also for the Palestinian community. It's very important within the Palestinian history for the young generation to understand that the history did not start during the first Intifada and did not start in 1967. It started a while ago when in 1936 when the women decide to come together and start supporting men in resisting the occupation, and it continued. But the main role that I felt while I was reading the history about females and about women in Palestine, about their role, that during the first Intifada, there was a lot of really very powerful stories and actions that women did, but it wasn't documented or it wasn't really maybe highlighted. And it's important for us as filmmakers to highlight these stories. Living under occupation for many, many years, and for sometimes for men or women, sometimes they reach this point that they are really can't handle the situation. They lost hope, and they feel that everything they can do, this will not end the occupation. So what happened that we decided to do a film to highlight what happened during the first Intifada from men and from women, and particularly from women because we feel after Oslo agreement of and when the Palestinian Authority returned back and after 1993, we felt that women a little bit were ignored and they did not really take the role that they really should take. And we felt that only like few women managed to be part of the political arena, and we did not see the number of women that they used to be active during the first Intifada. They felt that they left alone and nobody is asking them about anything, or at least asking them for their advice, or at least include them of building the system, the Palestinian system. So when we start doing this, we felt that even the Palestinian women we were interviewing, they were crying when they were talking about what they did, like how they used to empower the community, how they used, even during the curfew, when Israel imposed curfew on some of the villages and the refugee camps, and also the cities in the West Bank and Gaza, how they used to take food, medicine, to go and support other families. How they used to take bread, and inside the bread, as we see in the film Naila and the Uprising, they put the leaflets. They played really a very important role. But when the Palestinian state starts, like, and when the Palestinian leadership return back from outside, and they start building the institutions, women felt that they left alone. And I think this film allow us to highlight and document the stories of the great women and their role, not only during the Intifada, before and after. And they were telling us really very powerful stories about women and how they used to challenge their community. You know, here it's not easy for women, especially from villages, isolated villages, and religious community, to go outside and to work next to men and to resist the occupation, and maybe she will pay the price and be arrested by the Israeli. So this was really, this means that she really worked very hard to reach this level, and she think that her role is not less important than the role of men in her country. So there's a lot of stories that we, as I mentioned, we used to hear for the first time. This wasn't only my feedback, but when we screen the film here in Palestine for different communities, we hear it from the communities that, you know, I was active, but I decided to hide my story inside me, because I don't want the community to start talking against me. I don't want the Israelis to run after me. So a lot of powerful stories came out from women. Not all the stories, and not all the stories of the great women that we interviewed make it to the film, but still we have a lot of great stories from Palestinian women from different areas, and they were sharing their stories, and they said this is the first time that we feel that we can share our story, and we can help you to document these stories for the new generation.
I think, Rula, that's so important, or one of the reasons why it's so important to share this film, not just internationally, but within Palestinian communities, is to open up the space for more of these stories to be shared. And I think, you know, hearing you talk about women feeling like they had to hide their role in this creative nonviolent resistance movement, where they really were taking creative actions, right, to advocate for themselves, their families, their communities. I didn't know any of those stories, right? Naila was one of the first films that I saw that really centered these and the roles of women, not just in the Intifada, but in, you know, society in general. And so I'm so excited to see the ways this film keeps getting used in all communities to highlight and uplift the roles that women do play. And hopefully, right, invite women, as you've been saying, to keep sharing their own stories, memories, histories, and to show that this wasn't just a handful of individuals in one small place, but this really was across a people and could still be there today. I want to ask you a little bit more. I'm going to put it in the language of nonviolence because that's one of Tillis's principles. I know different people have different perspectives on what that means, but when I use that language today, I mean creative and clear resistance to injustice through nonviolent means. And for me, so many of the examples of what the women were doing through the alternative farming co-ops, through spreading the leaflets with the bread in the bags, as you were saying, really highlights the role of civil disobedience, right? A lot of what they were doing was illegal. It wasn't allowed under the occupation, but I would say it's still nonviolent. What about that and spreading that message is important, not just for the past, but for folks today, and especially young people today who want to resist the occupation and don't always necessarily know what that can look like in creative ways? Where do you see that coming up today, or what would you like to say around that piece of the film?
I think this is also really very important question, and it's really so related to the situation on the ground that we are facing daily. I can say that before we did Naila and the Uprising, we did a film called Budros. It's about a community in a village called Budros in the Ramallah district. And what really bring us to do this film is about the non-violence resistance movement in Palestine. that we decide to do like a film or document like story about a non-violence resistant movement in Palestine, to show the people in Palestine and around the world that Palestinians used nonviolence resistant movement, and they decide to use nonviolence to resist the occupation and to support their communities. And they really, we used to meet with 13, as far as I remember, 13 community in the West Bank, from the Hebron Hills, from Bethlehem areas, from Nablus, Tul Karem, Kalkilia, all the places in the West Bank. Every time we heard about people who are using nonviolence methods and they want to resist the occupation, they want to keep their lands and protect their lands and their family members. And every time we heard from them that they are using nonviolence, but it's not working. And when we went to interview the different leaders from the ground, we interviewed Ayed Murrar after we heard from different leaders from the ground that you should go to Budros, this village, small village, where the leader of the community, Ayed Murrar, who is also the main character of the film Budros, and his daughter, Iltizam Murrar, how they use nonviolence resistant movement and how they educate their community and how they bring together men and women, different political parties, and they decide to come together and save their lands from the Israeli bulldozers who decide to build the separation wall. So this is a story that really happened in different areas. Personally, I believe in nonviolence, but to be honest, sometimes you feel that what is going on in Gaza, how the Palestinian community or the leaders from the community, how they can use nonviolence while the bulldozers and the airplanes and the bombing, and how the thing that they can do is just to protect themselves, try to protect their kids and family members and be with them. It's hard now to compare, Sarah, between what is happening now and what's going on in Gaza, and how the people there are like suffering day and night for the 6 months. I don't know how they can manage, but at least I think women are great in protecting their family members, in protecting their neighbors, trying as much as they can to protect themselves. But you know that more than 39,000 Palestinian men, women, children have been killed until the day.
There's so much that you just said, Rula, that's so important. And I think starting where you ended there with never diminishing the impact on Palestinians, especially in Gaza right now and the violence they are facing, centering that, ending that, demanding a ceasefire, the return of hostages, humanitarian aid, but then also the respecting of Palestinian rights across the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Those are demands we have to keep making first and foremost, right? Prescribing how people should resist in these moments isn't something that I am comfortable doing. And for me, I want to point back to a couple of the other themes you were saying about why people often feel like nonviolence is ineffective. And I'd invite all of our listeners to engage in our second practice of peacemaking, which is listening to understand, or our first one, listening to understand. Because I think listening to understand why people, and especially Palestinians who experience violence at the hands of the Israeli army, feel like nonviolence doesn't work because they keep getting met by the same violence and they feel like it's not changing anything. Listening to understand that is super important because it helps us understand, especially as international supporters and people who believe in mutual flourishing, it helps us understand what needs to transform on the ground or how we need to engage in our own work to make sure that we are advocating in a way that uplifts the calls to action and the voices of those folks who are advocating nonviolently. That is a role that we can all play in the international community as people who care about nonviolence, care about peace and justice and mutual flourishing. It's when we see those nonviolent movements, we might not be on the ground next to them actively, resisting or or engaging directly, but elevating their voices, bringing international attention and pressure is so important to making those movements not just feel effective, but actually be effective. And that's how I see, when I talk about nonviolence as an international person who cares deeply about what happens, that's how I see my role and all of our role is to elevate those calls and make it clear, right, that we are watching. We won't stand for violent repression of nonviolent activism. And that's a huge part of how these movements become effective, which I think is also what we see in the film, Rula, when we see the international solidarity with the First Intifada, especially around economic pressure, and how that did eventually lead to, a failed negotiating peace process that went off the rails for so many reasons, but was a really important part of translating what was a deeply local movement into something that had international support and pressure. And as we wrap up our time together, there's so much more we could learn from you. But as we wrap up for today, I want to give you a chance to give our listeners a call to action. Part of the Learning Core is to dive deeper into the stories behind the headlines, to understand more about the context in Israel-Palestine, to dig deeper, but it's also to take what we've learned and transform it into action. And my call, as we are in this moment, as we witness what's happening in Gaza, is for everyone to continue demanding a ceasefire, the release of hostages, the access of humanitarian aid. But also, right, I'd love for you to speak into what we can do as international community members to support Palestinians who are advocating for rights, for flourishing, for safety, for freedom, for dignity in East Jerusalem and across the West Bank within the entire context of Israel-Palestine. What is your call to action for us coming out of this conversation today?
Thank you, Sarah. I think what is really very important is to call for ceasefire, because really what is happening in Gaza is like really nobody can accept it, and it's like really too much. And I don't know how people after this ceasefire, what will happen to the people there in Gaza? There is no schools, no universities, no hospitals, nothing there. So they have to return back and to rebuild their city again and again. And I don't know, without the international community and the support to ask for ceasefire, put pressure on Israel to stop what is going on in Gaza. I think this is very important. At least, we lost around 40,000 Palestinians so far, and there's still people are missing, and the injured people more than 79 or 80,000. It's a lot. It's a lot for a community to see. I think what happened recently in campuses, it was really very important. This is really what gives us as Palestinians hope that maybe the change will come. And we paid this price for maybe the international community to switch and to see what's going on the ground in Palestine. I think what we are asking for our freedom. Can anybody live under occupation for all his life? You can't move, you can't live your life normally, you can't go to work normally, you can't treat it as a human being, you are not allowed to travel, you are not allowed to see your relatives if they are inside in the 48 or inside Israel or inside Jerusalem if you are in the west from the West Bank. We need the support. I think what is really very important is also the settlers issues, which I believe that this also can be handled, because the extremists and the settlers who are burning homes and killing Palestinians and displace them, they are coming from either the States, the United States, or Europe, and they have different nationalities. I think there should be an action. If they are using violence against Palestinians and killing them, I think there should be a way for their original country to do something against them. We are hearing what the United States is taking some actions against settlers who are using violence. This is not enough, because we are not talking about 3 or 4 or 5. We are talking sometimes about thousands, and this happened in Hawara and in other villages. And there's really a big number of Palestinians Americans who live in the States, and they vote for the elections, and they have their own business in the States, and they are coming from these villages. I think this is a way for them and for also the international community to do something. Send investigation committees to see what's going on in the West Bank, what is going on in Jerusalem, like demolishing houses and confiscating lands. While this war is happening in Gaza, every day we are hearing about arresting people here in Jerusalem or in the West Bank, settlers burning homes and attacking villages. It's not in the international media. So I think this is important. Please educate yourself about what's going on in Palestine. Come and see what's going on here, and if you have friends who have really access to some media outlets who can read more and hear more about what's going on in Palestine, please, because I think without your help we can't get rid from the occupation and the settlers. It will be another fight and another war between the Palestinians and the settlers. We need to stop what the settlers are doing here by your help and with your support. And this is, I think, the most important thing these days. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Rula, for your time today, your insights, and for that call to action to tune in and not turn away. I'd encourage everyone, if you haven't seen the film Naila and the Uprising, to watch it, and if you have seen it, to go and check out the vast library of films and other resources Just Vision has to offer. They do an absolutely fantastic job of continuing to elevate the stories that aren't always covered by the mainstream news media. And as we end this series focusing on women and nonviolence, I encourage you all to keep self-interrogating the ways in which you can elevate the stories of creative nonviolence. How can you continue to support individuals and movements that embody what it looks like to creatively and clearly resist injustice? What does it look like for you to harness your own agency and responsibility to act in pursuit of mutual flourishing? Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.